Thomas Garrett arrived at the Spokane Rail Depot on the morning of October 14, 1902, alone. The station manager, William Hendricks, would later testify that Garrett descended from the Northern Pacific car without assistance, that his clothing was torn but not filthy, and that he carried nothing except a canvas haversack that appeared nearly empty. Hendricks noted the time, 8:47 a.m., because the train had been delayed by nearly 4 hours, and he had been expecting complaints. Garrett offered none. What Hendricks remembered most clearly in interviews conducted as late as 1931 was not Garrett's appearance, but his manner. He walked like a man who'd forgotten how to be in a crowd, Hendricks said. Kept his eyes down. When I asked if he needed help finding someone, he looked at me like I'd spoken in Chinese. Then he just shook his head and walked past. There should have been 4 men on that train. The expedition had departed Spokane on September the 2nd with clear objectives: a mineral survey of the Bitterroot Range, financed by the Consolidated Metals Company of Pittsburgh. Thomas Garrett, age 28, assistant surveyor. Daniel Pruitt, 31, lead geologist. Samuel Oakes, 26, camp manager. And Robert Fisk, 34, expedition leader and Consolidated's senior field engineer. All 4 men had signed contracts. All 4 had submitted route plans to the company. All 4 had been photographed together outside the Davenport Hotel on the morning of departure, a standard practice for insured expeditions. Only Garrett returned. He appeared first at his boarding house on West Riverside, where his landlady, Mrs. Ida Holcomb, would later describe him as polite but absent. He paid his overdue rent in full, in cash. He requested his room be held for another week. When Mrs. Holcomb asked where he'd been, Garrett replied, "In the mountains." She did not ask again. The Spokane County Sheriff's Office was notified on October 15th after Robert Fisk's wife, Caroline, arrived at the station in distress. She had received no telegram, no letter. Her husband had been due back on October 10th. She had gone to the Consolidated Metals regional office and been told the expedition had returned early, but only Garrett had reported in. Deputy Marshal Cyrus Lang was assigned to the case. His report, preserved in the Spokane County Archives, describes his first interview with Garrett on the afternoon of October 16th. Lang found Garrett in his room, seated by the window. The deputy noted that Garrett was clean-shaven, that his hands showed evidence of recent manual labor, calluses, shallow cuts that had healed, but no serious injury. Garrett answered questions clearly and without hesitation. Yes, he had been part of the Consolidated expedition. Yes, the others had been with him. No, they were not returning. When Lang asked where the other men were, Garrett said, "They stayed." Lang pressed, "Stayed where?" Garrett's reply, recorded verbatim, "In the mountains." The deputy asked if the men were alive. Garrett did not answer. Lang asked if Garrett knew their specific location. Garrett said he did not. Lang asked why Garrett had left them. Garrett said, "I was told to leave." By whom? Garrett did not answer. Lang's report notes that Garrett's affect was calm to the point of disturbing, and that he showed no visible distress when questioned about the welfare of his companions. When Lang asked if Garrett was willing to guide a search party back to the area, Garrett agreed without objection. The search party departed on October 18th. It included Deputy Lang, 2 county trackers, a physician, and Thomas Garrett. They followed the expedition's filed route into the Bitterroot Range, moving north along the St. Joe River drainage before turning east toward the Montana border. The party returned on October 27th, 9 days later. They had found the base camp. According to Dr. Edwin Marsh, the camp had been partially dismantled. 2 tents remained standing. Cooking equipment was stacked and covered. Personal items, clothing, books, surveying instruments were organized inside 1 tent, as if prepared for transport. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of animal predation or fire. There were also no bodies. The trackers found evidence of recent human activity, footprints leading away from camp in multiple directions, a cold fire pit, marks suggesting something heavy had been dragged toward the tree line. but the trails dispersed into rocky terrain and could not be followed with certainty. Dr. Marsh examined Garrett during the expedition. He found no injuries consistent with violence, no signs of starvation or exposure. Garrett's weight was within normal range for a man of his build. His lungs were clear. When Marsh asked how Garrett had sustained himself after leaving camp, Garrett said he had followed game trails to a logging road, then walked to a rail station. The doctor asked how long that had taken. Garrett said he didn't remember. Marsh's medical assessment, filed with the county, concluded that Garrett was physically sound and mentally coherent, but that he exhibited a persistent disinclination to provide narrative detail. The search party found no human remains. They found no evidence of a crime. They found a camp that had been lived in, then abandoned with care. On November 3, 1902, the Spokane County Sheriff's Office officially closed the case due to lack of evidence. No charges were filed. No further searches were authorized. The case was classified as a presumed wilderness accident involving 3 missing persons. Consolidated Metals declined to pursue legal action. The company issued a brief statement expressing condolences to the families and confirming that Thomas Garrett's employment had been terminated effective October 14th. Garrett did not contest the termination. Caroline Fisk, widow of the expedition leader, attempted to file a civil suit against Garrett in January 1903, alleging negligence and wrongful death. The suit was dismissed in March on procedural grounds. Without evidence of death, no wrongful death claim could proceed. Mrs. Fisk never spoke to Garrett directly. In a letter to her sister dated April 1903, she wrote, "He will not even do me the courtesy of lying." By the spring of 1903, Thomas Garrett had left Spokane. He reappears in census records in Butte, Montana in 1910, employed as a rail yard laborer. In 1920, he is listed in Boise, Idaho, working as a night watchman at a lumber mill. In 1930, the last record before his death, he is noted as residing in a boarding house in Coeur d'Alene, occupation listed as odd jobs. He never married. He maintained no known correspondence. He gave no interviews. In 1927, a journalist named Arthur Howell, writing for The Oregonian, tracked Garrett down in Boise and requested an interview about the 1902 expedition. Howell's notes, unpublished during his lifetime, describe Garrett as courteous but unyielding. Howell asked if Garrett had any statement to make about what happened in the Bitterroot Range. Garrett's reply, "No, sir." Howell asked if Garrett had ever told anyone the full story. Garrett said, "No." Howell asked if Garrett intended to. Garrett paused. Then he said, "I don't believe that would help." Howell pressed, "Help whom?" Garrett did not answer. The interview ended. Thomas Garrett died on March 8, 1932, in a Coeur d'Alene hospital of pneumonia. He was 58 years old. His death certificate lists no next of kin. His possessions, inventoried by the county, included clothing, a few books, a tobacco pouch, and $43 in cash. There was no journal, no letters, no map. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the Coeur d'Alene Cemetery, plot 44J, under the name T. Garrett. The burial was paid for by the boarding house owner, a man named Lewis Trent, who later stated that Garrett had always paid his rent on time and caused no trouble. Trent added, "He wasn't unfriendly, just private. Some men are like that." When asked if Garrett had ever mentioned the mountains, Trent said, "Once. I asked him if he'd done much hiking. He said he had. I asked if he'd liked it. He said no." That was the end of the conversation. The 4 men who entered the Bitterroot Range in September of 1902 were not strangers. Robert Fisk and Daniel Pruitt had worked together on 3 previous surveys for Consolidated Metals in Nevada, Colorado, and Northern California. Fisk, the senior engineer, was known in the industry as methodical and risk-averse, qualities that made him valuable to a company that had lost men to avalanches and unstable mines in prior years. Pruitt, the geologist, was younger and more ambitious, but he respected Fisk's caution. Letters between the 2 men, preserved in Pruitt's family papers, show a collegial relationship built on mutual competence. Samuel Oakes had been hired specifically for the Bitterroot expedition. He had no prior connection to Fisk or Pruitt, but his references were strong. He had managed camps for logging operations in Oregon and had a reputation for efficiency. He was unmarried, a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and known to be reliable in isolated conditions. Thomas Garrett was the least experienced of the four. He had worked for Consolidated for only 8 months prior to the expedition, mostly in clerical roles at the Spokane office. His background was in railroad surveying, and he had applied to the company seeking field work. His supervisor, a man named Howard Lyle, would later describe Garrett as competent but unremarkable. Lyle recommended him for the Bitterroot assignment because the company needed a fourth man, and Garrett had requested the opportunity. Garrett was the only member of the team who had never worked in true wilderness. There is no evidence that the men disliked each other. Letters written in the days before departure suggest the opposite. In a letter to his wife dated August 30th, 1902, Robert Fisk wrote, "The crew is solid. Pruitt knows his geology, Oakes runs a tight camp, and the new man, Garrett, seems eager and doesn't complain. We should have no trouble." Daniel Pruitt, in a letter to his brother, wrote, "Fisk is as cautious as ever, which suits me fine. Oakes is ex-military and keeps everything shipshape. Garrett is green, but willing to learn. I expect we'll be back in 6 weeks. No drama." Samuel Oakes left fewer records. He had no immediate family and wrote infrequently, but a postcard sent to a friend in Portland, dated September 1st, reads, "Heading into the mountains tomorrow. Good crew. Weather looks fair. We'll write when we're back." Garrett himself wrote nothing before the departure that survives. Mrs. Holcomb, his landlady, recalled that he had seemed a bit nervous, but excited. She asked if he was worried about the trip. Garrett had smiled and said, "I'm sure it'll be fine." The expedition's stated purpose was straightforward: to survey a remote section of the Bitterroot Range for mineral deposits, specifically copper and silver, and to assess the feasibility of future extraction. Consolidated had acquired mineral rights to the area in 1901 and needed a preliminary report before committing to infrastructure investment. The planned route was approximately 90 miles, round trip, beginning at the rail depot in St. Maries, Idaho, and proceeding northeast along established trails before cutting into less traveled terrain near the Montana border. The survey was expected to take 4 to 5 weeks, with supply caches established at intervals and a final rendezvous point set for October 10th at the same depot. All 4 men carried standard field gear: tents, bedrolls, cooking equipment, surveying instruments, maps, compasses, rope, axes, firearms for hunting and defense, and rations calculated to last 6 weeks with supplemental game. They were photographed on the morning of September 2nd outside the Davenport Hotel. The photograph, now held in the Consolidated Metals Company archives, shows 4 men in sturdy work clothes standing in a line. Fisk is in the center, arms crossed, looking directly at the camera. Pruitt is to his left, smiling slightly. Oakes stands to the right, serious, hands at his sides. Garrett is at the far left, half a step back from the others, his expression neutral. He is the shortest of the 4. He looks younger than his 28 years. The photograph was standard procedure, insurance documentation. It was never intended to be a memorial. The men departed Spokane by train at 10:15 a.m. and arrived in St. Maries by early afternoon. From there, they hired a local packer to transport their gear to the trailhead, approximately 12 miles north. The packer, a man named Emil Strand, later testified that the men were in good spirits, that they joked about the weight of their packs, and that Garrett, the least experienced, had asked Strand for advice on managing blisters. Strand's advice: keep your socks dry and don't stop too often. Garrett thanked him. Strand watched them disappear up the trail and thought nothing more of it. "They looked like they knew what they were doing," he said in a 1903 interview. "Fisk had done this kind of thing a dozen times. I figured they'd be back in October, same as always." The first 2 weeks of the expedition proceeded without incident. This can be confirmed through a series of brief messages left at a ranger station near the St. Joe River, a standard practice for expeditions entering remote areas. The messages, written by Fisk, were dated September 8th, September 13th, and September 19th. They reported progress, weather conditions, and morale. The final message read, "All well, moving east to survey zone, expect to return by October 8th. That was the last external communication. What happened inside the expedition during those weeks can only be inferred. In the 1927 interview, Arthur Howell asked Garrett if the men had gotten along during the trip. Garrett said, "Yes." Howell asked if there had been any arguments. Garrett said, "Some." Howell asked, "What about?" Garrett paused, then said, "The usual things." Howell pressed, "What usual things?" Garrett said, "How far to go, when to turn back." Howell asked if Garrett had disagreed with Fisk's decisions. Garrett said, "No, I wasn't the one in charge." Howell asked who had disagreed. Garrett did not answer. Years later, in 1948, a researcher named Margaret Calloway interviewed surviving relatives of the missing men as part of a master's thesis on early 20th century mining expeditions. She spoke with Daniel Pruitt's younger brother, who shared a partial letter that had been found among Pruitt's belongings after he was declared legally dead in 1910. The letter, dated September 20th, 1902, was unfinished and never sent. It read, "We're deeper in than I expected. Fisk wants to push another 2 days north before we start the survey work. Oakes thinks it's fine. Garrett doesn't say much either way. I'm not worried, but I'll admit the terrain is rougher than the map suggested. We're burning more time than planned. Still, the initial samples look promising. If we find what we're looking for, this trip will have been worth it." The letter ends there. Margaret Calloway's thesis noted that the letter suggested no alarm, but a recognition of complexity. She concluded that the expedition had encountered challenges, but nothing that would have warranted early termination. There is one more piece of evidence from this period. In the inventory of items recovered from the base camp in October 1902, Deputy Lang's report lists a small leather-bound notebook belonging to Samuel Oakes. The notebook contained supply lists, mileage estimates, and weather notes. The final entry, dated September 26th, read, "Temp dropping. Fisk wants to finish the northern quadrant before heading back. Garrett asked how much longer, told him 3 days, maybe 4. That entry was the last written record before the separation. The base camp was located at approximately 47°18' N, 115° OUW, in a narrow valley sheltered by dense pine and hemlock. The site was chosen for its proximity to a creek and its relative protection from wind. It was roughly 42 miles from the nearest logging road and 68 miles from the St. Marie's Rail Depot. The camp had been occupied for at least 10 days. This is known from the condition of the fire pit, the wear patterns around the tents, and the amount of preserved food remaining when the search party arrived. Dr. Marsh estimated that the camp had been abandoned no more than 2 weeks before their arrival, possibly less. What happened at that camp between September 26th and the day Garrett left cannot be reconstructed with certainty. No journal entries exist from that period. No letters were written. The only testimony is Garrett's, and Garrett did not testify. What is known is this. On October 14th, Thomas Garrett returned to Spokane alone. On October 27th, the search party found the base camp intact, but deserted. In between those 2 dates lies the separation. Deputy Lang's interrogation of Garrett, conducted over several days in October and November 1902, focused heavily on the sequence of events. Lang's handwritten notes preserved in the case file provide the most detailed account of Garrett's statements, though even these are fragmentary. When asked when he last saw the other 3 men, Garrett replied, "At camp." When asked what day, Garrett said he wasn't sure. Late September, maybe the 28th or 29th. When asked what the men were doing when he left, Garrett said, "Packing." Lang asked if they were packing to leave. Garrett said, "I think so." Lang asked if Garrett had helped them pack. Garrett said, "No." Lang asked why not. Garrett said, "I was told to go ahead." This phrase, "told to go ahead," appears multiple times in Lang's notes. Lang repeatedly asked Garrett to clarify who had given the instruction. Garrett's replies varied slightly, but remained vague. Fisk, the group. It was decided. Lang asked if Garrett had objected to leaving. Garrett said, no. Lang asked if he understood why he was being sent ahead. Garrett said, to get help. Lang asked what kind of help. Garrett hesitated, then said, I don't know. Lang pressed. If Garrett didn't know what help was needed, why did he agree to leave? Garrett's reply, because they asked me to. Lang asked if anyone was injured. Garrett said he didn't think so. Lang asked if anyone was sick. Garrett said no. Lang asked if there had been an accident. Garrett said no. Lang asked if there had been a conflict. Garrett said no. Lang asked if they had run out of supplies. Garrett said no. Lang asked if they were lost. Garrett said no. Lang asked if they were in danger. Garrett did not answer immediately. Then he said, I don't know. Lang's frustration is evident in the notes. At one point he wrote, subject is evasive without being deceptive. Answers questions, but provides no context. Shows no emotion when describing departure from companions. In a separate interview, Lang asked Garrett to describe the last conversation he had with Robert Fisk. Garrett said Fisk had told him to follow the creek drainage south until he hit the logging road, then to walk west to the rail depot. Fisk had given him a small amount of money and told him to send a telegram when he arrived in Spokane. Lang asked what the telegram was supposed to say. Garrett said he didn't send one. Lang asked why not. Garrett said, I forgot. Lang asked if Fisk had explained why Garrett should go alone. Garrett said Fisk had not. Lang asked if Garrett had asked. Garrett said no. Lang asked why Garrett hadn't asked. Garrett said, it seemed clear enough. Lang asked what seemed clear. Garrett did not answer. The search party's findings at the camp raised more questions than they resolved. The 2 tents that remained standing were in good condition. One contained the surveying instruments, neatly stored. The other contained personal items, clothing, a Bible belonging to Fisk, a shaving kit, a deck of cards, Oakes's notebook. Outside, the fire pit had been covered with stones. Cooking equipment was stacked under a tarp. A rope had been strung between 2 trees, but nothing hung from it. The trackers found footprints leading away from camp in 3 directions: south toward the creek, north toward higher ground, and east toward the tree line. The southbound prints were consistent with a single individual. The northbound and eastbound prints suggested at least 2 people, possibly 3. The southbound trail, the one Garrett would have taken, was the clearest. It followed the creek for approximately half a mile before the ground became too rocky to track. The northbound and eastbound trails dispersed into difficult terrain and could not be followed beyond a few hundred yards. Dr. Marsh noted that the camp showed no signs of hurried departure. If they had fled in panic, he wrote, they would not have taken time to organize their belongings. If they had been forced to leave, there would be evidence of coercion. This appears to be a deliberate, orderly departure. But a departure to where and why? The search party spent 5 additional days combing the surrounding area. They found no bodies, no abandoned gear, no signs of violence or predation, no indication that the men had become lost or injured. They found nothing. When the search party returned to Spokane, Lang met with Garrett one final time. He asked Garrett if there was anything at all, that Garrett had not told him. Garrett said, no. Lang asked if Garrett was certain. Garrett said, yes. Lang asked if Garrett felt any responsibility for what had happened. Garrett looked at him for a long moment, then said, I don't know what happened. Lang's final note in the case file reads, subject maintains he was instructed to leave and did so. He claims no knowledge of the men's fate and offers no theory. He shows no guilt and no grief. He is either the most callous man I have ever interviewed, or he is telling a truth he does not wish to explain. The case was closed, but the silence had only just begun. The families did not accept silence. Carolyn Fisk, the expedition leader's widow, spent the better part of 1903 attempting to extract answers from anyone connected to the case. She wrote to Consolidated Metals, demanding they fund a second search. The company declined. She wrote to the Spokane County Sheriff, requesting the case be reopened. The sheriff replied that without new evidence, there was nothing to investigate. She wrote to Thomas Garrett. Her letter, dated January 12, 1903, was brief. Mr. Garrett, I do not know what happened in those mountains, but I know you do. My husband was a good man. He deserves better than this. If you have any decency, you will tell the truth. Garrett did not reply. Mrs. Fisk wrote again in March, and again in June. Neither letter received a response. In a letter to her sister, dated July 1903, Mrs. Fisk wrote, "He will not answer. I do not think he is cruel. I think he is afraid, but I do not know of what." That Daniel Pruitt's family took a different approach. His father, a physician in Tacoma, hired a private investigator named Raymond Soames to re-examine the case. Soames spent 3 weeks in Spokane in the summer of 1903, reviewing Lang's files and interviewing witnesses. He also attempted to interview Garrett. Soames's report, delivered to Dr. Pruitt in August, included the following summary of his conversation with Garrett. I found Mr. Garrett employed at a rail yard in Butte, Montana. He was cordial, but firm. I explained that I was working on behalf of the Pruitt family and asked if he would be willing to answer some questions. He said he had already answered all questions for the authorities. I asked if he would answer them again for the family's sake. He said he did not see how that would help. I asked if he knew what had become of Daniel Pruitt. He said no. I asked if he had any suspicions. He said no. I asked if he regretted leaving the men. He paused. Then he said, "Every day." I asked if he would reconsider speaking about what happened. He said, "I have nothing more to say." The interview ended. Soames concluded that Garrett was not withholding information out of malice, but out of a conviction that silence serves a purpose I cannot determine. Dr. Pruitt did not pursue the matter further. Samuel Oakes had no immediate family to advocate for him. His only known relative, a cousin in Tennessee, expressed regret, but did not travel west or hire investigators. Oakes was declared legally dead in 1909. His military pension was transferred to the cousin, who used it to pay for a modest headstone in a cemetery in Knoxville. The stone reads, Samuel Oakes, 1876-1902, lost in service. The inscription was not accurate. Oakes had not been in military service in 1902, but the cousin saw no reason to correct it. The broader public showed little sustained interest in the case. A few regional newspapers ran brief stories in late 1902, mostly focusing on the mystery of the missing surveyors. The Spokesman Review published an editorial in November 1902 titled The Silence of the Mountains, which speculated on possible explanations: an avalanche, a fall, an encounter with hostile wildlife, even foul play. The editorial concluded, "We may never know. The wilderness keeps its secrets." No follow-up stories appeared. The case faded from public attention by early 1903. It was filed alongside dozens of other wilderness disappearances from that era, tragic but unremarkable. Except for one thing: Thomas Garrett kept living, and he kept refusing to speak. Over the next 30 years, Garrett moved frequently. He worked menial jobs, rail yards, lumber mills, warehouses, night shifts. He lived in boarding houses, paid in cash, and left no trace. He was described by those who knew him, landlords, employers, occasional acquaintances, as quiet, reliable, and utterly unremarkable. He drank, but not heavily. He attended church occasionally, but joined no congregation. He read newspapers, but rarely discussed current events. He had no hobbies, no close friends, no romantic relationships. In 1914, a former Consolidated Metals clerk named Albert Finch encountered Garrett by chance in a Helena, Montana saloon. Finch, who had processed Garrett's employment paperwork in 1902, recognized him immediately and approached him. Finch later wrote to a friend describing the encounter. "I asked if he remembered me. He said yes. I asked what he'd been doing since Spokane. He said, working. I asked if he ever thought about the expedition. He said, sometimes. I asked if he'd ever told anyone what really happened. He looked at me and said, there's nothing to tell that would make any difference. I asked what that meant. He finished his drink and left. In 1921, a reporter for the Boise Statesman, writing a retrospective on unsolved regional mysteries, attempted to contact Garrett for comment. The reporter, Louise Varner, located Garrett working as a watchman at a lumber mill and requested an interview. Garrett declined. Varner wrote to her editor, "He was polite but absolute. I offered to keep his remarks off the record. He said it didn't matter. I asked if he would at least confirm whether the men were alive when he left. He said, 'I've answered that question before.' I checked the old reports. He hadn't, not directly." Varner's editor chose not to pursue the story. The most persistent inquiries came from Arthur Howell, the journalist who interviewed Garrett in 1927. Howell had become fascinated with the case after reading about it in a collection of Pacific Northwest historical oddities. He spent 6 months researching the case, tracking down relatives, reviewing old files, and attempting to piece together a coherent narrative. Howell's unpublished manuscript, donated to the Oregon Historical Society after his death, runs to over 200 pages. Much of it is speculation, but it includes meticulous documentation of his attempts to get Garrett to speak. Howell wrote to Garrett 4 times before receiving a reply. The reply was a single sentence: "I have nothing to add to what I told the authorities in 1902. Howell traveled to Boise and waited outside Garrett's workplace for 3 evenings before Garrett agreed to speak with him. The conversation, as noted earlier, was brief. Howell's notes suggest he was struck not by Garrett's hostility, but by his calm. "He did not seem evasive," Howell wrote. "He seemed resolved, as if he had made a decision long ago and saw no reason to revisit it. When I asked if he had nightmares about the mountains, he said, 'No.' When I asked if he felt guilt, he said, 'Not the kind you mean.' I asked what kind he felt. He said, 'The kind that doesn't need to be explained.'" Howell left Boise convinced that Garrett was not hiding a crime, but protecting something. He could not determine what. In his manuscript, Howell wrote, "The silence is not the silence of a guilty man. It is the silence of a man who believes that speaking would be a betrayal. Of whom or what I cannot say, but I believe Thomas Garrett knows exactly what happened in the Bitterroot Range, and I believe he will take that knowledge to his grave." He was correct. In the final years of his life, Garrett's health declined. He developed a chronic cough, lost weight, and eventually could no longer work. He moved into a boarding house in Coeur d'Alene run by Louis Trent, who allowed him to stay on reduced rent in exchange for light maintenance work. Trent later said that Garrett rarely spoke about his past. He'd mention working on the railroad or the mills, but nothing specific. I asked once if he had family. He said no. I asked if he'd been married. He said no. I asked if he regretted that. He said he didn't think about it. Trent added, he wasn't unhappy, just elsewhere. In early March 1932, Garrett's cough worsened. Trent called a doctor who recommended hospitalization. Garrett resisted but eventually agreed. He was admitted to Coeur d'Alene General Hospital on March 5th. He died 3 days later. The attending physician, Dr. Lawrence Kemper, noted that Garrett was lucid until the end. Kemper asked if there was anyone Garrett wanted to contact. Garrett said no. Kemper asked if Garrett wanted a priest. Garrett said no. Kemper later told Trent that Garrett had been peaceful. "I've seen men die afraid," Kemper said. "He wasn't afraid. He just seemed tired." There was no funeral, no obituary. No one claimed the body. Garrett was buried in the Coeur d'Alene cemetery in an unmarked grave. Louis Trent paid for the burial because, he said, it seemed like the right thing to do. When asked if Garrett had left anything behind, letters, belongings, anything that might explain the 1902 expedition, Trent said there was nothing, just his clothes and a few books. "I gave the clothes to charity, kept one of the books for a while, but there was nothing in it, just a book." The book was a copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, published in 1900. Trent donated it to the local library in 1934. There were no annotations, no inscriptions, nothing. The historian arrives at silence not as a failure, but as a fact. The case of Thomas Garrett and the 1902 Bitterroot expedition resists resolution not because evidence is missing, but because the only person who could speak chose not to. And that choice, sustained over 30 years across multiple cities through poverty and illness and isolation, cannot be explained by fear or cowardice or simple forgetfulness. It was intentional. This much is clear from the pattern of Garrett's responses. He did not refuse all questions. He confirmed facts. He acknowledged the expedition. He admitted he had left the men. He even expressed regret, but he would not explain. When pressed, he did not become defensive. He did not anger. He did not fabricate. He simply stopped answering. This suggests that Garrett's silence was not evasion, but protection. But protection of what? The most common theory, advanced by families and investigators at the time, was that Garrett had witnessed a crime, possibly committed it himself, and was concealing the truth to avoid prosecution. But this theory fails on several points. First, Garrett cooperated fully with authorities. He returned to Spokane. He submitted to interrogation. He led the search party back to the camp. If he had committed a crime, his behavior was extraordinarily reckless. Second, no evidence of violence was ever found. No blood, no bodies, no signs of struggle. If Garrett had killed 3 men, he would have had to dispose of their bodies so thoroughly that not even a trained search party could find a trace. An implausible feat for a man with no wilderness experience. Third, Garrett had no motive. He gained nothing from the men's disappearance. He lost his job. He lived in poverty. He was harassed by families and investigators for years. If he had wanted to benefit from their deaths, he would have needed to fabricate a more convincing story. The crime theory does not hold. A second theory is accident. Perhaps the men died, fell, drowned, were killed by animals, and Garrett, ashamed of having survived or failed to help, refused to speak out of guilt. But this theory also has problems. If the men had died by accident, Garrett had no reason to conceal it. Wilderness deaths were common. The families would have grieved, but they would not have blamed him. Consolidated Metals would have closed the case. Garrett could have moved on with his life. Instead, he chose to remain silent, knowing that silence would invite suspicion. That is not the behavior of a man ashamed of an accident. That is the behavior of a man protecting something he believes is more important than his own reputation. A third theory is that Garrett did not know what happened. Perhaps the men told him to leave, and he left, and he genuinely had no idea what became of them. This is consistent with his statements. "I don't know what happened." But if Garrett truly did not know, why refuse to say so clearly? Why not describe the circumstances of his departure in detail, explain that the men had sent him ahead for reasons he didn't understand, and express his own confusion? Instead, Garrett spoke in fragments. He answered questions but withheld context. He said just enough to avoid lying but not enough to explain. That is not the speech of an ignorant man. That is the speech of a man who knows more than he is willing to say. So what did Garrett know? The only evidence is what he did not say. He did not say the men were dead. He did not say they were alive. He did not say they were lost. He did not say they stayed willingly. He did not say they were in danger. He did not say they were safe. Every question that required him to characterize their state, alive or dead, safe or endangered, willing or coerced, was met with silence. This suggests that Garrett knew something about their condition or intention that he believed should not be spoken. Perhaps because it was too painful. Perhaps because it was too strange. Perhaps because it was too private. In the 1927 interview, Arthur Howell asked Garrett if telling the truth would help anyone. Garrett said, "I don't believe that would help." Not "I don't know," not "I'm not sure." "I don't believe." This is a statement of judgment. Garrett had considered the question and concluded that speaking would not help. Help whom? The families? They were desperate for answers. The truth, however painful, would have been better than silence. The authorities? They had no case to close. The truth would have given them closure. Garrett himself? Silence destroyed his reputation. The truth would have cleared him. So who would speaking harm? The only remaining possibility is the men themselves. Garrett's silence, sustained for 30 years, makes sense only if he believed that revealing what he knew would betray the men he had left behind. Perhaps they had made a choice. Perhaps they had asked him to leave and to say nothing. Perhaps they had their reasons. And perhaps Garrett, who was never the leader, never the strongest, never the most important, perhaps Garrett honored that request the only way he could, by saying nothing, by living with the weight of it, by taking it to his grave. There is a photograph in the Consolidated Metals Archive taken on September 2nd, 1902, of 4 men standing outside the Davenport Hotel in Spokane. Robert Fisk, Daniel Pruitt, Samuel Oakes, Thomas Garrett. They are dressed for a 6-week expedition into the Bitterroot Range. They look capable. They look ready. In the photograph, Garrett is standing at the far left, half a step back from the others. He is the shortest. He looks young. He is looking at the camera, but his expression is difficult to read. Not quite smiling. Not quite serious. Just present. That is the last image of the 4 men together. 3 of them never came back. 1 of them did. And for 30 years, when people asked him why, Thomas Garrett had the same answer. Nothing. The historian does not know what happened in the mountains. The historian knows only this, that silence too is a kind of testimony. And sometimes the things we refuse to say are the truest things we know. Thomas Garrett refused. And in that refusal, something was preserved. What it was, we will never know. Perhaps that was the point.